Welcome back. You're listening to the panel discussion, Implementing a Multi-Cloud Strategy, sponsored by VMware on federalnewsradio.com and 1500 AM. I'm your host, Jason Miller. My guests today are Tom Sasela, the Director of the Army Operations and Architecture in the Office of the CIO G6, Daniel Corbin, the Chief Technology Advisor for C4 Headquarters for the U.S. Marine Corps, Randy Conway, the Deputy CIO for Information Enterprise of the Defense Department, Larry Reed, the Assistant Director for Security Operations at the Justice Department, and Bill Rowan, the Vice President of Federal for VMware. Right at the end of last segment, we started talking a little bit about security and the challenges that come with it and the impact and the SLAs and making sure everyone's on the same page. And one interesting point of all this, and we just started to touch upon the mobile side, is when you talk about problems, it's really the user's the problem. I mean, I think, Tom, jump in here a little bit. The data center is rarely the problem, or the cloud provider is rarely the problem.
Yeah, so I was listening to what Bill was saying earlier, and we've noticed this trend across the entire department, very specifically in the Army. Army's at 1.1 million odd users or so. Where we're seeing the attacks from a key terrain perspective are really not at the data center or the cloud environment per se, right? They're well protected, they're well insulated, they're distributed in nature, they're difficult to back into. So most of the attacks really happen at the endpoint, whatever your endpoint might be. Traditionally, we spent a lot of time and energy in the Department of Defense to secure the desktop or the laptop, data encryption at rest, encrypted file systems, all sorts of software, many different pieces of software to really watch what the user's doing and protect against the malicious attack. And the paradigm has shifted over the last few years to more what I'll characterize as mobile devices that are more handheld in nature. They don't have that flexibility where we can just deploy another, for the department, it's called HBSS, the host services. We can't put that on an iPhone or on an Android phone necessarily, number one. Number two, in some cases, there are people who need to use their own device to do work. For simple things, it could be like time accounting, right? You're at home and you need to do your time card, right? Or more mission-oriented sort of effects, especially if you're downrange and you're in a tactical environment where the only connectivity you have is cellular rather than some broadband connection. So we're growing more and more concerned about this. And back a few years or so ago, the Army started this thing called every soldier is a sensor, but that's kind of more leading us into this Internet of Things or Internet of Everything, and I guess the W3C now has something like the Web of Things is what they're calling it. I don't know that I can keep up with these acronyms, to be honest with you. I think the DoD is bad, right? But as more and more things become Internet aware, right? There's more possibility to inject malware or create avenues into your environment, and it's the depermanentization of the entire enterprise has led to a situation where every device surrounding you might be active at some point in the future, right? Which requires not only active protection but active defense, right? There's a botnet that I think it took over all the electronic thermostats or whatever in the world not so long ago. So just think of that. I mean, that's innocuous and relative in nature, but imagine taking over the industrial control systems of, say, a building like the Pentagon or a big federal building like GSA, and just simply disabling the HVAC. It's an inconvenience for the users, but it's really not a great thing for a bunch of servers in the data center. And so we're very concerned about that and the environmental nature about where as mobile users move in and out of our normally physically protected environment with gates, guns, and guards, right? What are they doing in the Starbucks? What are they doing on that Starbucks network? What is someone else doing in Starbucks on that network that might influence them that can then lead back into the enterprise?
Randy, jump in.
Oh yeah, so we're making for endpoint users, I mean, most of the computing devices we buy today have wireless connections. And so if you don't have that trusted connection, then you have immediate vulnerability put in. Just like traveling to the airport and you go to DC and you can say, do you want to connect to the DC Wi-Fi system, right? Well, it's not secure. And so if you're a mobile user, basically you could do that. You could go ahead and make that connection, all right? And then you could go in through our VPN if possibly, or you could just go out to the internet. So there's that kind of a vulnerability point that's available, and that's also on the mobile devices, the handhelds. Mm-hmm. And so when I'm sitting there and waiting for my flight and I'm looking at my iPhone and I got LTE, which I know is secure, or I go into the Wi-Fi system in the airport and it's to save battery life or something or whatever, then there's a risk there. So when we basically what I'm saying is that the more mobile and the more capable we make our users, then the more risk we're putting into our network at large, because that is it's a balance. How much do you prevent from happening? Because you want all of our users to be as productive as possible, and so it's just something to be mindful of. And so from the endpoint security standpoint, it is a key. It's one of our focal points right now is endpoint security.
Bill, jump in and solve my problem.
Well, I don't think it solves the problem, but I think what's interesting to note is a couple quick things. We talked earlier in the program about the use and the adoption of software as a service. VMware conducted a study recently of federal employees and managers, and all of them talked about they thought the productivity level of their work environment would rise by having some sort of, if you will, a digital workspace where those applications were available to them. So that's a good thing. We see increased productivity. The secondary impact, though, is that in that survey, we found about 74% of the employees were using tablets or handheld devices, but only about half of them were authorized. So again, they seem to be moving towards, I want to be more productive, irrespective, and maybe probably against the agency or department's guidance, it may not necessarily be an authorized device. So much like we talked about the shadow IT and someone going out and swiping a credit card to buy cloud services, I think we are already starting to see this issue of people saying, listen, I want to try to be more productive, whether it's working from home or at the airport getting ready to go TDY on a flight. I think that we have to start pushing the game forward to say, listen, these devices that out there on the edge, at some point in time, something's going to become compromised. That's where we've seen the compromises in the past. And so the question becomes, with some of the microservices, can we catch those threats before they impact the balance of the network? And I think that's where it's going to shift our security game a little bit from where, as Tom points out, we've done a really good job of protecting that data center environment. And we need to continue to do that. But we'll see the threat shifting more and more to the edge. And the question becomes, can we adjust our tactics, techniques, and procedures to ensure that nothing becomes a bigger threat out there than it already is today?
So Larry, as our security guy, can they guard against those compromises?
So you can't prevent them all, you never will, but certainly the transition to some of the services we've been talking about, like software as a service, where your perimeter really becomes authentication, and it's not access to the data center anymore, so the scope of any kind of compromises is reduced on those things. As we look at authentication and software as a service and pulling the cloud apart a little bit and maybe re-engineering the applications, as mentioned earlier, to support that environment, I think it's a risk we have to manage that way, because the perimeter is gone. It isn't there anymore, and Internet of Things and the next iPhone or whatever the next flashy device is, people are going to use them to do their job because they're people. That's what they do.
Daniel, let me turn to you, because a lot of the discussion went back to mobile. We talked about, as Randy was talking about, whether you're at the airport or somewhere else. Marine Corps is all about mobility, right? So you guys are, again, we've said this several times, are at the maybe leading edge, the bleeding edge in some ways of the mobile need. How are you dealing with that issue?
Yeah, you're right. Mobility is a large priority for the Marine Corps, not only for the tactical user. That is going to be a big part of the strategy. They're using tablets and small factor handhelds today out in the environment. From an application security, we are driving that through standards. The Marine Corps has established software development standards that will then move the people away from the developers, away from the hardware themselves. Has two advantages. One is it'll allow us to build applications more quickly as they get tested and the application is abstracted away from the hardware. That will ultimately have to be solved. But it also allows us to certify the applications much more quickly as you give them a standardized platform under which to operate. We're doing that both inside of the for the garrison in user devices as well. but also in these tactical ones. So it's going to be about standardizing the applications and how they can be developed so that they can be certified more quickly.
So Dan, let me jump in real quick, because what happens if you have a Marine who's in theater and they develop something kind of real quick? Hey, we had this problem, we fixed it. Do they have access to this standards, to this, if you will, the dev test environment?
Yeah, so
or is that in the works?
Yeah, so I don't think we're at the point where a Marine out in the field can actually develop the software and put it on his device. But I will say that last year we ran something called the Mobile Application Challenge, where we just went out to the Marines and said, anybody want to do anything along these 3 or 4 categories? And we got a handful of them. 2 of them are actually being adopted in the Marine Corps to be used within the Marine Corps. We're doing that again this year.
And they all follow these standards that you just talked about to meet the security.
That's correct.
Bill, let me turn to you real quick, because one of the things about mobility is we heard a lot about software as a service, and that could maybe hold some of the key to dealing with the security question, but also have access to the data, to the services. Is the mobility piece the next challenge, if you will, that these guys are all facing, or they're in the middle of facing, I guess?
I think most of the services have adopted some aspect of mobility, whether that mobility may be defined as a virtual desktop or actual tablets, handheld devices, or whatever else is the next shiny object that kind of comes down the path that IT or that users start to consume from. So I think agencies have already done a very good job in setting the base foundation of how we're going to move forth with this. I think that there's going to become a greater reliance on mobile platforms probably over the next 3 to 5 years than there have historically been. I think we'll see less impact of desktops. I equate this issue somewhat to the telephone situation. If you go back 10 or 15 years ago, it was unheard of that you would have a home without a telephone in the house. And then there were people that went to, hey, I'm going to have a VoIP phone inside my house because it'll be tied back to my internet service provider. And today, you see the next generation saying, I'm just going to have my mobile device. It's with me everywhere. I think we're more than likely to see a same type of impact down the stream relative to desktop computing. The historical, if I go back again, that 10 or 15 years ago, that box that sat below someone's desk that then transitioned to a laptop will now transition to some type of potentially mobile device that plugs into a docking station and that will be used with some type of handheld. That's the trend we're going to see. This issue won't go away. In fact, if anything, I think what you're hearing from the panel is that the procedures and the policies and tactics that we are using today, we will continue to refine to protect that endpoint and ensure that that is just as secure as that desktop was, with the concept that the applications they're using and the way people are interacting with those core services, that will continue to evolve, but we're staying ahead of the process at this point.
Tom, jump in for a minute and help me understand something. When the Army, for instance, is looking at getting mobile devices out to the field, to soldiers in the field, or even just in theater, but necessarily maybe not at the front end of the front lines, how are you guys looking at thin clients? How are you guys looking at zero clients? Where does VDI play a role? That came up several times. Is that part of your strategy?
So it is part of the strategy, and to be clear, the soldier in the field is the ultimate mobile user, right? So traditionally, the Department of Defense has gone out and built specialized systems, typically weapon systems in nature, tactical radios, tactical communications packages, gear that was dedicated for the soldier to use in the field. What we're starting to see is more adoption of commercial capabilities at the edge. Satellite type communications, Iridium is a big adopter. When things like LTE or 3 and 4G are available, use of those as well. And so for VDI in particular, generally speaking, that's at the the kind of the garrison level or the BCT and above level, or brigade combat team and above level. For people that are at fixed locations, fixed stations, and you might be operating a tactical set of gear at a fixed location, but it's still tactical in nature. It's tied into our tactical network. So in the Army's architecture, we have really 2 distinct clouds. If you want to look at it, what we know as the DoDEN A, or the Army's version of the larger DoD enterprise enterprise network, and then the tactical side of it. So those are pieced together. And so the idea is what we want to do is create a transportable environment of just like the cloud that's hybrid in nature, well, the endpoint devices will be hybrid in nature as well, right? So a knowledge worker can float between the two clouds back and forth with whatever form factor is most efficient and effective for their mission at the time. That might be a handheld, that might be what we call a medium-sized mobile device, something like an iPad, right? Or a large form factor device, a full-up laptop, or even desktop computer with a monitor, right? And so we want to provide that flexibility. And so using the cloud, using the transportability, the elasticity of the cloud, coupled together with a ubiquitous network environment, whether it's wireless or wired, right, is kind of the big vision for the Army. And I think that's shared between DoD and all the component commands.
Randy, let me turn to you. You probably get the last word of this for the day from a DoD perspective. From the again, we'll start where we start, 50,000-foot view. Where is this heading toward? Do you have thin clients? Do you have zero clients? Do you have VDI? Is that all part of your long-term strategy or even short-term?
Absolutely. We're doing it not just with handheld mobile devices, but we're doing it with how we implement all of our VDI. That whole hyper-converged infrastructure is sort of our basis for getting to virtualization, the whole concept of virtualization, and getting it to where we can have zero client or thin client user base, user communities, because it's so easy, it's so much easier to manage. The difficulty only comes when you try to do to communicate with our deployed warfighting component, right? You have to put something forward, okay, that can at least replicate at some point with the sustaining base end of it. But that's doable, and we have products right now that we have tested that can do that. So, but that's where we're headed, and it's just going to be growing. This is just like, this is the whole cloud experience, the whole virtualization. It's changing the way we communicate and we do IT in the department. And the department is trying its best to keep up with it because we have so much legacy that it's difficult. And sometimes industry doesn't quite understand why it takes us so long to do something, but it's because we're sitting there thinking, how do I take this great thing that industry came up with and how do I implement it in my old network design or my old infrastructure? And it's just a struggle for us. That's why we're going to always be busy. All the people sitting at this table here, even our DOJ friend there, is going to be doing this all the time, because we're government. We're going to have a legacy infrastructure. We're big, and so we always have to do it. But I think that's absolutely what we're going to do. The three things you pointed out are absolutely where we're headed with a lot of this stuff.
All right. Unfortunately, though, we are out of time. This has been a fascinating conversation. I'd like to thank my guests for today. Tom Sasela, the Director of the Army Operations and Architecture in the Office of the CIO G6. Daniel Corbin, the Chief Technology Advisor for C4 Headquarters for the U.S. Marine Corps. Randy Conway, the Deputy CIO for Information Enterprise for the Defense Department. Larry Reed, the Assistant Director for Security Operations at the Justice Department. And Bill Rowan, the Vice President of Federal for VMware. Gentlemen, thank you so much for taking the time today.
Thank you.
I'm Jason Miller, and for more on this discussion, visit federalnewsradio.com and search VMware.
On behalf of VMware, thank you for joining us. A link to this archive session will be sent to you shortly. If you're requesting a training certificate, you will also receive an email with the download instructions after the webinar. This concludes our discussion. Thank you.